No, don't adjust your sets. It's just the friendly bear. Or is it a friendly bear? They are a friendly bear, aren't they? It depends on how you were brought up. Maybe you're terrified of white fluffy things. I've introduced you to Cosmo. They are very friendly. It's not he or she, it's they. That's a tricky one, isn't it? And I'm introducing you to the topic of art and faith. And maybe you have a question, what has art to do with faith? Well, if you have read or begun to read the first page of the book, you'll have a suspicion that there is a connection. The eternity tasted in every aesthetic apprehension. Tonight we're going to do the impossible, have a peek at art in general in the cosmos. My 1904 reference tonight is James Joyce, not with Molly and Poldy in Ulysses, but as leaving Ireland, leaving home. And the bear is relevant in that if you read the portrait of an artist, you'll find that he starts with the small child and he moves to the departing young man in 1904. The book was written between 1904 in Dublin and 1914 in Trieste. And we'll come back to Joyce as we move along through the question of art. First of all, then, our list. You'll find that our list includes points already mentioned: faith and art. As usual, I raise the question of exercise. And the exercise I invited you to do, I sent you out a reading from Insight on Art, 184, 185. I want to talk a little bit then about types of art, the process, that of course is a key word, the root, or let's say roots, and the reach. And our second topic is cosmogenetics. Exercise, diagrams, and would you believe it, total view. Now, I had that listed the last day as well, cosmogenetics, and I had, in fact, a final point, the quest. Let's just jot it down. Let's be optimistic. And let's put down another puzzling word, meta-quest. We've used the word meta before with one T. I'm introducing a little twist here. I'm putting in a second T, and it brings to mind, for those of you into Buddhism, the meditations of the Buddhist tradition, the early Buddhist tradition, which means a self-awareness in loving kindness. Okay, so let's see, can we get some distance towards that? Don't forget, this is a superficial half credit, and it doesn't really matter whether we get anywhere. I was thinking this morning of one of my professors, a professor of Hebrew. We were doing Hebrew, and of course we have the whole Bible to read. And he had the principle of minimal coverage, that if you can't do the whole course, it doesn't matter how little you do. It's a terrific idea. So in fact, I think all we did was we read the first page of the Bible and then a page somewhere later on. That was my education in Hebrew. Okay, so in this superficial half credit, we're just touching on these topics. And the more I work at it, the more I realize that touching to which I'm inviting you is so difficult in our culture. I keep coming back to this question of institutions that oppress our capacity. Again, I perhaps at this stage don't have to recall for you that key page 83 with capacity and need and institutions, role, tasks, and the opposition of these thousands of years between the institutions we have manufactured and the yearnings of the human spirit, of the human bone, really, when we come to talk about faith and art. Okay, so faith and art. I started with this bear. There's a type of therapy that is contemporary where it's an adult type of therapy, and apparently it's a search for the inner child. That's what it's called. And sometimes the therapy, it's a bit like the primal scream therapy. The people end up hugging their bear, rediscovering something that they lost. You may have had a friendly bear when you were small, and it may have been the only friendly thing in your universe, because your parents were nuts. And they gave you the furry bear because everyone else was giving furry bears, not because they liked you at all. I mentioned earlier Karen Horney, the neurotic personality of our time. Here we are. Okay, so the furry bear is significant. It is an elemental sculpting. Friendly, perhaps. The central notion of faith that I brought out was a conviction of friendliness, of not totally hostile, very minimal. And this brings it out very radically in perhaps childhood and existential biographic terms. Well, you could at least cling to the little bear. You got brutal parents, brutal grandparents, you go to a brutal school. Am I being cheerful enough? Okay, so conviction. Not totally hostile. Friendliness. Where I'm not spelling out friendliness, we've hinted at it. The last thing I want to do is give definitions. But think of friendliness for the child who is listening to fairy tales, and then there's wishing wells. Yeah, fairy stories. Well-wishing, benevolence, once upon a time. That's how the portrait of an artist begins. You can see that there's an elemental way in which there's a telling or a calling. All thing is well. In the portrait of an artist, there's a wonderful discussion of art, and it's borrowed from Aquinas. I haven't followed up on that period from 1277 on Aquinas. What happened to Aquinas? Well, there was a renewed interest, and James Joyce happened to get in on that. And his view on art comes from this fat old friar, as he talks about him. And it's quite surprising that I find in James Joyce a line that is almost a quotation from a Chinese dictionary, written in 100 AD. I will send out this page for exercises for the last day. It's 3 pages out of the portrait. My edition that I'm using at the moment is the Penguin edition. It's been published lots of times. I think 1975 is the date on mine. Page 211, 212, and 213. I hear you are writing some essays about aesthetics, and Stephen starts talking about aesthetics, and he talks about a basket Much as I might talk about the bear. See that basket, he says. First, you've got to separate the basket from the rest of the visible universe. The first phase is a bounding line about the object to be apprehended. To paint is to draw boundaries, is the first line, and it's quoting this dictionary. And it goes on to discuss the Chinese symbol for painting and the movement of the hand, drawing a boundary. Now, what I want to bring out a little bit tonight, it's the focal communication, and there's a way in which I might pause on it. The difficulty is we can't do that in contemporary media. Pause. In a class this morning, we had a film of Degas, and it all led to seeing The Little Dancer that he produced 1881. It's a famous little figure. But the problem is to pause. And again, Joyce brings out this stasis. Now, to pause over this point, what point? The drawing of a boundary. I want to bring out a basic thing about art which fits in a curious way with what I said earlier, that art draws attention to the possibilities of human living. The quotation I drew attention to last week from Bernard Lonergan on page 77 of Wealth, when he says, for centuries, economists, educationists, philosophers have done not a little to make life unlivable. And art can pull you out of that. Now, there's the curious reverse process, that the drawing of the line focuses your attention on an inattention outside the line. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me illustrate it, say, by, well, let's take the line. You focus. I could have brought various books, and I decided, no, let's depend on your imagination. I wanted to bring a book of Henry Moore's photographs of his sculptings. Let's say you focus on a sculpting of Henry Moore, and many of you have seen these sculptings. There's a fair number in Toronto, Boston, there's some in Dublin, and of course there are a lot in Britain. And some of these are outdoors, and you have the sculpting, the thing, I put that in there. Joyce uses the word thing as a unit, and you focus on it, and you have a notion of the months that, say, Henry Moore spent caressing this piece of stone, whether it's realistic or just a shape. And you focus on the magnificence of the achievement, and it invites you to attend. And I think there's a larger attention involved, and that is that it draws attention to your non-attending to where this sculpting is. Okay, in other words, I'm thinking now of a particular sculpting that is in a forest area. And there's a way in which the sculpting helps you to notice that you do not notice the sculpting around the sculpting. Now that's a very quick opening up of this topic of friendliness, well-wishing, non-aggressive. That's the marvelous thing about being in the presence of art. If you're not in the company of people who are pressurizing you to use the art, you're not being babbled at by people who want you to comment on a painting, or a professor who wants an essay on a good book. You're in the presence, and it is friendly, and its friendliness leans on the context. So you can imagine perhaps a great sculpting at the bottom of a mountain, or a great fountain at the bottom of a waterfall. And there's a certain humor in saying, can you imagine that you're down at where's this, that waterfall is in Canada? Niagara. You're down at Niagara, and there's a nice fountain in the square, and you're admiring it, and somebody says, that's nice too. Okay, so there's a sense in which when drawing the line, it calls your attention to a unity, a radiance, an integrity, all the things Joyce talks about on this page, but it also calls attention to the context in which the art object appears. And that's the key point that I'm moving towards here when I talk about the reach. What is the reach of the aesthetic experience? Okay, now to get that far is to undertake a 10-year climb. And I continue to be serious about that. The seriousness of my suggestion relates to this exercise. There's a sense in which some of you must be saying, the guy must be joking. I talked about the little dancer of Degas. 5 years he worked on it. And sculptings that he worked on later in life that were not discovered until after he died. He was going blind, but he went by sound and feel. He talked about a model he was working on, and he was fairly blind, and he said, I can see her by the sounds she makes. I think she was combing her hair. What are these people doing? They're peeking at a peak, but they're attending in a way with which we are not familiar. And we shouldn't be threatened by that. Now, when I said we could stay on this topic, well, we can't, realistically. The occasional time I've had to go through the horrors of television interviewing, the last thing the interviewer wants is a pause. Now tell us about this and tell us about that, and the time is ticking over. We've got to get 2 more minutes noise in before the ads. Sometimes I'm amused when I reflect back on what we call the primitive. I can't imagine a primitive journalist. I mentioned the magic circle dance. I can't imagine a primitive journalist standing on the edge of the circle, and as the people move around for hours on end, waiting for a quick minute interview, tell us what you're at. No, there's a reverence within the so-called primitive for meaning that is not present in either our contemporary media or in our contemporary university. So we're not going to pause then and look at Cosmo the bear. But I do invite you, by reflecting on my own experience of reading these pages, to weigh up the possibility that perhaps your pace of so-called living is outrageously, ridiculously fast. Locomotion, no emotion. I mentioned in the second lecture how it was so strange that we admire all these weirdos. I mentioned Cézanne spends his life looking at a hill. And yet people lecture on it. Why? Because deep down in the roots of us, there's a suspicion that these folks are right on. I mentioned Ezra Pound's comment on Flaubert's Ovar et Pécuchet, that he had captured the essence of the 20th century. We're in a hurry, hurrying along to die, and yes, to die. Okay, the exercise then of reading these 2 pages. I've been doing this exercise myself, I was thinking of it today, for 35 years. And I read these 2 pages more than once in the last week. Have I made some sense out of them? Well, a little more this week. Am I joking? What is this talking about? It's talking about the person who wrote this, there exists in man an exuberance above and beyond the biological. Well, what man is he talking about? Huh? Is it the capital Mensch that Germans write about? I recall Bernard Lonergan joking about the fact that if German had been in English, all these capital letters would not get into psychology. Okay, so the exercise is discovering the exuberance. And I'm pushing this because it's the whole point of the superficial half credit. From some of you, I'm getting marvelous intimations of discovery, yes. And I'm relating this exercise to the exercise 625 of Insight, which you'll find on process page 36, where I introduce Cosmo. Cosmopolis, my fictitious friend, now identified as the bear. Cosmo, the exercise was reading a paragraph about the concrete being of man. And now drawing attention to one particular piece of it, the concrete being of man, etc., his sensitivity matches the operator of his intellectual advance with a capacity and a need to respond to a further reality than meets the eye and to grope his way toward it. Okay? A capacity and need, grope its way towards it. And you have the quotation on the very front, the frontispiece, the taste of eternity in aesthetic apprehension. And this invites you to do the same sort of exercise. Now, recall what I said about reading, that one of the crises of our time is that we're not taught to read. Now, I'm opening the word read up to attend, and attend in any of the art forms. And that's my next topic, to give a sense of what I mean by reading. Insofar as you link this up with last day, you can link it up with the topic listening, and then you can link it up with the Christian Trinity, and the listening in the Trinity, and a listening to a word, if you remember the diagram. We'll get back to that. Okay, so it's an exercise, and eventually we can connect it to the exercises of the 3 types of Buddhist meditation. Okay, so art. What is art? A little pointer before we move into types. And the pointer is towards a reversal of the problem we had last week of reading. Remember the exercise? I don't know quite what you mean. Please clarify. That was an exercise in reading misstatements about human beings. This is an exercise in reading statements that are made with precision and out of a background of elemental clarity. So as you read down through the bottom of page 184, you will find, insofar as you've digested our elements, that you're discovering an identity of elements as you move through the reading. The exuberance, the reach. I'm not going to go into the whole 13 elements immediately. You have, again, the diagram of the mess, and you have the whatting. I'll put in the word maybe, Mayday, May Queen, amazing. The reach of the artist and the person present to the artist is, all right, the artist is reaching not to formulate some idea, but to concretize, so that there's an object. It's not an inner word, it's an outer expression. But you can notice as you read this that insofar as you have come to grips with these elements, you can actually read this. Now this is a carry-on from where we left off the last day on Thomas Aquinas. Why could Carl Jung not read Thomas Aquinas? Because Carl Jung did not know Carl Jung. I pause there because that's a terrible thing to say. Isn't this the great hot shot of self-knowledge? No. Okay. So reading Aquinas and much more reading Lonergan is a matter of knowing your elements. Not knowing your elements is like trying to get through second-year chemistry without having any idea of the periodic table. Doesn't that make sense? Yeah. Getting through first-year chemistry without it. Yeah. Okay. So insofar as one is struggling with these elements, and in our superficial half-credit, how far have we got? We've named them. We can put them in the right order, most of us. Some students in their exams, they just give me a list of 13 and, you know, try and remember them bit by bit and leave the last 3 blank. Okay, no, it's like the periodic table. Well, you could pick it out from the dictionary, but that's not the meaning of the periodic table. Doesn't that make sense? The periodic table correlates hydrogen, helium, sodium, potassium, so on. Okay, so having that in mind, you can come to grips with the minding of the artist who is liberating the idea and objectifying it in a way that will attract the other human being. Quotation from Degas, which I heard again this morning. Art is not so much a matter of what you see as what you can make the other person see. Okay, so that's the question of this exercise, and an exercise in reading. And the problem of the presupposition of reading this is that you can't read it properly until you get to page 747 of the book. Isn't that terrible? Yeah? Okay, so again, we're back to where we started at the beginning. This vortex motion, which relates also to the psychology of Jung, the searching for oneself. You're going round, yeah? Emma, me, whatting in Hebrew. Okay, so I'm inviting you to read this again. Some of my students tell me that it's very disappointing. You do a reading, you come into class, and I talk for a little while, and you find that you haven't read it at all. Okay. Let's just mention types. And this is helpful in that we've got to keep this concrete. We're not discussing art in the abstract. You've got to think of the reach of your sensitivity. All right. That's the maybe level. What about the level of sensitivity? Well, if you look at process 100, you'll find a layered diagram. So all right, I'll put it in like that. That's the level of understanding. And we've talked about the 13 elements. And the first element which looked so simple, the level of sensibility, is the level that needs 4 major fields of inquiry to begin to investigate: the zoological level, the botanical level, the chemical level, and the physical level. And the development of art depends on developments in these levels. For instance, op art depends on developments in physics. And architecture depends on developments in chemistry, and so on. Okay, so the level of sensibility, and that level which we've talked about as dominated by a moral law, a law of mores, of habit, which I named at the bottom of page 52 of Welt as be attentive. Okay. And as some of you are noting, I'm making this thing desperately complicated. What is it to be attentive? I mentioned being attentive, say, to a musical friend. Wow. And one of the problems of being attentive is to admit that one is not capable of being attentive. And it's a terrific achievement. And it's one that we will talk about more as we work down towards cosmogenetics. What is my way? My way may not be the way of a great intellectual. There's a problem of a democracy in the academy at the moment where everyone is a second-class genius. I began the very first evening talking about that, the problem of a peak at a peak. That there are human beings who climb, like Rembrandt, Tolstoy, Beethoven. But most of us putter along here. But the culture in which we live is an academic culture where there are a lot of folks up here, or pretending to be up here, commenting on Beethoven, and so on, Rembrandt, Goethe. And the result of that is that you downgrade the younger searchers. Now, I claim that I'm somewhere here, and I have listened to Chopin and read Lonergan and done a little mathematics, and they're way beyond me. And I don't think it's difficult to admit that, and yet I find the academic world is not capable of doing that. I've talked about Aquinas, and I talked about Lonergan, and the failure to read Aquinas. And I know at the moment there's a developing culture called Lonerganism. And I get the impression that we have a lot of people writing symphonies here who can't play the fiddle. So the question of the neurotic state of our time is pretty horrific. Whether it's on the level of aesthetics or, as we'll see later, on the level of government. Heavens. Our ministers after 2 days have come up with a magnificently creative scheme of $1 billion project making roads. 2 days to come up with that? Okay. So the question of being attentive is a profound problem in the 20th century, and it is one of the reasons why there is an enormous movement towards the metta, the Buddhist, the Zen tradition, somehow a withdrawal to find oneself. Okay, so being attentive then, the art forms bring out networks of attentivity. Now, as an exercise, I won't ask you to do it in the next week. One could see, how would one correlate this area of the human subject with the 5 or 6 senses, and then with, say, my 10 art forms? That's a nice exercise if you have nothing to do at the weekend. What are the 10 art forms? Human reaching. There's a reaching for a home. sparrow hath found herself a nest, the Canticle of Canticles. A shipmate, a ship, a circus company, a camp, an urban site, an oasis, oh God help us, Halifax. There's a reach for a place that will call you to be yourself, and that's the field of architecture. Sculpting, these are arts of space. Now, I'm gliding over these merely so that you notice the spread of what is meant by art. To even begin to get a sense of sculpting would demand that we pause over, well, even our bare, get at the bare truth about sculpting. Okay, it's an objectification of the subject. It invites you to notice the thing called the subject, that we are, that our friends are. And it's an enormously complex and problematic area, because any unit, I had this notion of thing here, Joyce saying, look at this basket, look at these chairs. The units around us do not address us in a way that enhances us as things, as human things. I'm not going to go into that now. I think immediately of the tradition of sculpting and architecture that is associated with the Bauhaus, German worker housing that was imported into North America for light entertainment. Read Tom Wolfe, From Bauhaus to Our House. An incredible destruction of creativity in architecture and sculpting. Downtown, visit Calgary. Painting. Draw boundaries and an integral decoration. And what does it do primarily? I refer back to Degas when somebody said, well, isn't landscape painting a revelation of the soul? And Degas said, no, it's a revelation of my eyes. We painters are not so pretentious. The primary thing about painting is it rests your eyeballs. Your eyeballs are a reach, a yearning for patterned colors. And one of our problems is that we can grow so inattentive and so used to being abused that we no longer notice the horrific colors around this university, say. The drabness of our urban colors, so on. So there's a yearning in us for these, and one can notice this, and I mentioned this in the second or third class about, say, the children's yearning to color your lovely beige walls. Don't do that. It costs us money. Let the child loose in a ramshackled garden, and you'll find architecture, sculpting, painting. How many of you can remember that? I'm thinking now, I have a friend, but also it's my own interest too, a friend in Montreal who has an ambition to really design a proper bath. Well, I can think of the baths of the Eccles Street in which Joyce's couple lived and coupled. The baths, they were funny big things, and they had lovely feet. Any of you ever see these? Yeah? And as a child, you could nest in under the bath, and if in the later period they added in showers, it was a proper shower, you know. When you turned it on, it didn't hit you in the eye. How many of you have seen baths like this? Am I really out of date? Yeah? I am, yeah. Okay, so a world that addresses you in a way that's magical instead of little boxes. The next art form I want to mention is the art I'm dependent here on Suzanne Langer, as you will know from chapter 6 of Wealth. And I have a sense that the art form dance should be called an art of space and time. It's a very concrete, not just temporal art. It's a space-time art. For me, it's the art of this century. We could pause over it for an hour, certainly. If you take literally the century from the 1890s in Russia and work through, I've mentioned some of these people, up to Twyla Tharp, Merce Cunningham, and so on. There's a little book by a man called McDonough, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Modern Dancing. And it's a sad fact that, for instance, in our university, there's not much interest in this very profoundly central element of human subjectivity. And even if you take yourself downtown, I won't mention the locales, the dance isn't exactly alive and well, especially in the male of the species. You ladies know that when you go out dancing, you find that your partner's standing there sort of pedaling. Okay, and I mentioned the magic circle, the division of the sacred from the profane by the dance patterns. But there's a yearning in us, a kinesthetic reach for patterns, which we lose track of in our adulthood. Yeah? And then, of course, there's the art of time, which is music. What time do you live in? And the problem is that our real time is the time of the music, not the time of the clock. We're clock-bound. Whereas our yearning is for the rhythms of music, and for rhythms way beyond the rhythms available to us in our own culture. I'm thinking of, the rhythms and tones of Chinese music, Indian music, the brown Indian music, and so on. And we have it in us. We can be called into. These are all callings. If you remember our 5 whys, this is the bottom level of why, and this is a listing of the callings. And it's a very general listing because there are synesthetic arts that tie up these together. You can think of, say, Wagner's aspiration of integrating the arts in opera. And you don't separate these off. You can associate dancing with sculpting and the art of touching. I'm recalling now watching a little girl dance around a huge statue in a European city. It was one of these giant hero statues, and the foot was out at the back, and it was about 2 feet long, the foot, and a little girl came dancing around and saw this huge foot and floated over and tickled the sole of the foot. It was just marvelous. She was in the presence of this sculpting, dancing. Okay, and then you have the arts, the linguistic arts. And all right, let me just jot them down. In terms of past, present, and future. Again, this is one way of handling these. You'll find when you get that page from Joyce that he has another view of lyric, epic, and dramatic. Here I note that the linguistic arts can be handily divided into arts that invite you to remember, ranging from the lyric to the epic. You're reading a novel or reading a poem, and you're remembering. I remember, the place where I was born, the daffodils, so on. The Homeric epic. The arts of the present, and again, I'm not going into this zone or even making distinctions as Marshall McLuhan might between one type of film and another type of film, the cool and the hot and so on. There is a sense in which it is worth reflecting on film as an art form of the present relating to an objectification of dream structures. It has the same way of centralizing the dreamer or the watcher. And then the arts of the future, in the sense that, properly speaking, in the drama is going into the future in front of you in the theater. And the drama goes forward in patterns of either tragedy or comedy. Okay, that's just a listing of the main art forms within Suzanne Langer, to which I add two art forms, the art forms of taste and smell. They're not discussed by Langer. Herbert Reed, the great authority in art, says there are no such art forms. Obviously, he doesn't eat. So there is a huge field of art, of taste and smell, and there's a synesthetic art, culinary art. And perhaps ladies are more familiar with this than men, the question of varieties of perfumes and so on. But also there the art form of, say, flower design. And that's a very subtle art form if you're actually taking in the smell. One of the few dabblings I ever did was a little bit in poetry, a little bit in music. I wrote a third of a waltz once, and I did do flower designing. Maybe I should have stuck with that. Okay, so you have 10 basic art forms, and these are the central dynamic of our searching. There's a way in which people think of art as sort of cream on the cake. No, 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 no. No, this is the substance. This is the orientation of our attention. This is the tension in us, not for bread alone. But there is a sense that we get in culture that there's a sort of a veneer, a paint over, associated with art, and that is cultivated by even by the cost of art nowadays. Okay, types of art. Now, when we talk about the process, I can't find what art form turns you on. You have to think out the process in terms of some art form that appeals to you. And again, I ask that you think not of art with a capital A, but of an art that does appeal to you. It may be a 30-minute comedy show on television. Okay, the process. Now, what we're doing when we talk about process is we're revising. What is the process? How would you go about working on the process? Let's say we were doing chemistry, and we raised the question, as happens in a first-year chemical course, of a process of doing such and such. Well, you know immediately it's going to involve the 113 elements, and you select out of them. Fair enough? Huh? So there is a process in art, and it involves subjects. Okay. So we're back to Jack and Jill, or Molly and Poldy. Fair enough. And insofar as you've absorbed the background, you spontaneously say, well, okay, in what way are the elements operating in this field? It's a searching relating to the bottom level. Okay, now let me make that level bigger. Not in relation to this, but in relation to a particular need I have to develop this particular point in the process. A need I have to divide the bottom level in, say, Ludwig, Beethoven, Phil Collins maybe. Should we have a vote? Well, let's take Ludwig. I think it was last week I wrongly talked about Beethoven's 21st Piano Concerto. It's obviously Mozart's 21st Piano Concerto that was used in the film Elvira Madigan, but that's not too bad. Beethoven has his 13 elements, same as Emma. Okay. I mentioned last day that when you're trying to think out things like this, you do need diagrams. If you need them in chemistry, you certainly need them when you're asking about the complexity of human beings. And you need different diagrams. And the different diagrams stop you being trapped in some simple-minded view from one diagram. So, for instance, I'm dividing the bottom here into images and feelings. Okay. Now, lest you think that this is simple, you have to go back and find that, well, images are zoological and botanical and chemical and physical. There are brain waves associated with certain images and so on. Okay, what is the process? Let's just put a big question mark there. And I'll keep putting in the word maybe. I emphasized that the last day and the day before as solving the problem of the identity of the two what questions. What is it and what might it be? Both the same. And yet so different, because the maybe question about the future, what might it be, it's so much more difficult to answer, isn't it? Remember I talked about, say, you have your friends coming to dinner. And the sensible thing is to decide on what you cooked before. Yeah? And many of you are really courageous, and you have important people coming to dinner. You know, they're going to give you a job if you feed them well, and you decide, heck, I'm going to be inventive tonight. Yeah? No way. Okay, so the maybe towards the future is very difficult. I heard a couple of years ago a quarter of an hour of Beethoven's 10th Symphony, put together but from bits and pieces, scribbles. And you hear it and you can say, maybe not. You have the finished 9th, and yeah, this, okay, maybe it's recognizably Beethoven, but you would expect, if he was writing a 10th, he would have surprised us. Sometimes I imagine, what would Beethoven have done if he had lived on, like, say, Haydn, written 100? Wow. Okay, and this is relevant to the question of art and mystery and the search for the future that we will get to, maybe, eventually. Okay, he's searching for a maybe, which is the rhythms of himself. And like the basket in Joyce, or the painting, or the sculpting, it's a unit. He's looking for a unit image in himself, related to which there are feelings. I mentioned at the very beginning the problem of the bear. Perhaps you feel terrified of the white bear. There have been experiments, horrific experiments in psychology on children who eventually are terrified of Santa Claus's beard. You may have seen the film The Clockwork Orange. But there are congruent feelings. The Pastoral Symphony, the 7th Symphony, the Emperor Concerto. Now, what does Beethoven put forth? He puts forth images, and I have to use odd words sometime. isomorphic. The same form as the image. There are notes on paper. There are movements in an orchestra. Okay, so there's an objectification of images. Eventually you've got the orchestra and the conductor. Inviting images in Emma, the listener, to which there may be congruent feelings, feelings of the same type. Now, we could spend the rest of the time on this problem, because if you read, again, it's a question of reading other authors, you will find that most people who talk about art talk about the objectification of feelings. He gave a feelingful performance. That painting is vibrant with emotion. Well, it's not. Cosmo is not vibrant with emotion. Neither is the Ninth Symphony. It's an image. The feeling is in Beethoven and in Emma. Now, our problem of peaking at the peak is that the feeling and the image in Ludwig is way beyond Emma's. And that's the problem of the great artist, the great thinker, Plato, the Buddha, Socrates, whatever, that there's a beyond. This person is entirely beyond us. I quoted Ashkenazi in an interview once, when the interviewer, as they do, they want immediate communication, and he asked Ashkenazi, well, what do you think of Beethoven? And Ashkenazi says, I'm not going to talk about Beethoven. Sometimes when I draw this in class, I draw Emma tiny. And the thing is, it's part of our greatness that we're tiny. I quoted in my third lecture, I think, Patrick Kavanagh, and related it to what I was trying to do here. He had the knack of making men feel as small as they really were, which meant as great as God had made them, but as males they disliked his air. Is it so self-damaging to discover that I am in great company? There are artists, there are crazy people like Beethoven and Degas and Cézanne and Rembrandt, who see differently, who have attention way beyond our imagination, but who invite us and add that invitation to the cosmic invitation. And the cosmic invitation is the invitation that we're talking about in faith, a friendly cosmos. And this addresses us, as does the entire cosmos. But that invites us to pause, to get into that view of stasis that Joyce talks about. The 10 years I talked about before. How soon will I get enlightenment? Well, 10 years. And if I try harder, maybe 20. That's a very difficult thing to face in our time. Some of you are wishing now, oh gosh, I should have taken another half credit. This is terrible. And even if you opt out open-mindedly. I'm not up to this. I prefer to be a zombie. It's a clear-headed option. And one of my students did that. Wonderful.